Section 5, Paradigmatic Critiques. If during the previous section the materialist-positivist paradigm seemed lacking to you, you're not alone. There have actually been numerous criticisms leveled against the assumptions of the scientific establishment for quite a while now. But so long as those criticisms remain absent from mainstream curriculums and hidden from the culture at large, it's a moot point. As the old saying goes, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it really make a sound? Same, too, might be wondered about ideas and arguments that remain voiced only in old books and obscure lectures that fail to impact the zeitgeist of the modern age. So the purpose of this section is to discuss the shortcomings of and counter-arguments against the MPP and the dogmatism related to it, as well as begin to suggest viable alternatives so that we can hopefully recalibrate science towards a more fruitful path. In 1962, American historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn published his classic work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he detailed the procession of what he dubbed paradigm shifts within the scientific community. He introduced an idea that's come to be known as the Kuhn cycle, which depicts how these shifts take place over the course of time. Usually, science is relatively calm in its progression as it operates under a certain set of assumptions, its paradigm, in a stage that Kuhn dubs normal science. Often cited here is the example of mainstream physics, which works well for our purposes. We could say that in modern history, since the time of Isaac Newton, classical mechanics was the defining paradigm of the field. The basic Newtonian laws of motion were considered sufficient to explain all of the observable phenomena in the universe. But as time goes on, inevitably the models and assumptions of any scientific field will gradually begin to prove themselves inadequate. This is referred to as normal science dysfunction by Kuhn. This period of dysfunction grows until it naturally gives rise to a normal science crisis, where it becomes clear to pretty much everyone involved that there are groundbreaking implications resulting from these insufficient models, or from the introduction of completely new ones which better explain the fields as a whole. Keeping with the physics example, we could say that a paradigm shift occurred with the introduction of Einstein's theories of relativity and his models of space-time curvature and/or the development of the standard model of quantum dynamics. This then results in a paradigm shift, which ultimately changes the operative assumptions of the field in question. The lower half of this cycle that we're seeing often results during times of transition from one generation of scientists to another. Younger minds enter the fields, and a few mavericks who aren't married for whatever reasons to the old ideas and models pave the way for these major shifts to take place. I have a suspicion that this cycle is currently being heavily resisted by the institution via the trends mentioned in Section 3, such as the publish-or-perish culture and the lowered intellectual standards required to go into the sciences professionally. Again, ladening scientists with mountains of busy work and ensuring the profession is saturated with sophomoric minds yields an environment where very little philosophy is seeing the light of day. This would benefit the powers that pretend to be greatly, who would prefer to maintain a certain status quo. Just as the Kuhn cycle can be witnessed in specific scientific fields or subfields, it can also occur, if more rarely, in science as a whole. Perhaps the current demolition of the MPP we're going to be discussing is the herald of a completely new way of approaching science. This would open the floodgates for an enormous number of alternative proposals, hypotheses, and theories to be given consideration that have been, in the meantime, dismissed and derided as a sort of heresy by the mainstream vanguards. Right now, I'm not sure we're quite at the point of paradigm shift, as the scientific community is still very much entrenched in its old ways. However, I do see a case for the argument that we are currently moving through the bottom half of this circle. I hope to use Lifeology in some way to nudge us along towards this eventual paradigm shift. Failing that, it could be that we witness the emergence of a parallel scientific system to compete with the legacy machine. Either option is fine with me. Now, I'm going to bring in a term that's been gaining quite a bit of popularity in recent years: Scientism. This word was first coined by the Austrian-British polymath Friedrich Hayek in his 1952 book on the nature of the human mind titled The Sensory Order: An Inquiry into the Foundations of Theoretical Psychology. Briefly, scientism is a pseudo-philosophical position that a person can take, which states that the explanations provided by the scientific community are the basis of all truth, and that in situations where reality might be disputed by multiple schools of thought, the default move should always be to go with what they say. This has been likened to science enthusiasm taking on a dogmatically religious-like adherence. We saw it come out into the open just a couple of years ago, during the heyday of COVID, with phrases like "trust the science" being used as a stand-in for the sentiment that one should obey the officially sanctioned mandates being spouted by televisions and social media feeds. Many people in the public became radically possessed, viewing anyone who questioned the official narrative as infidels guilty of sacrilege, in much the same way as a religious zealot might do when they hear people questioning the validity of the Bible or the Quran. The social scientist in me was both alarmed and intrigued watching this happen, especially as I was witnessing this wholesale debasement of science, where its most fundamental philosophical tenets were being brushed under the rug in favor of one of "shut up and obey," clearly the antithesis of what science is supposed to be. Sociologically, this can be understood as yet another iteration of a psychological complex people have to rally themselves around an object of worship and lose themselves in group consciousness. Here, they can all convince each other and themselves that they're vanquishing some great evil together, manifested in other tribes that exist outside their own. Members of these outgroups are meant to be attacked, usually in the form of ridicule and social ostracization, but recent history has shown that they're not above going after them in more alarming ways, such as financially or even physically. And this can all be so easily leveraged by those with a modicum of influence and knowledge of group psychology. Throw in a few charismatic leaders, and the people are putty in their hands. Social engineering of this kind is an ancient practice. It just needs a new coat of paint every now and again. A person captured by cults like this are given tacit permission to proclaim moral and intellectual superiority over others who have not yet subscribed to their doctrine. But despite their emphatic insistence that they're enlightened by rationality, whatever illumination they've attained is a false light handed to them externally by those who have opted to do their thinking for them. In truth, I believe they're just as lost as the religious fundamentalists they wage culture war with. Famed English poet William Blake was known to have referred to their mentality as a Newtonian sleep. Despite all this, though, the scientific community seems to have in large part wholly embraced this public perception of themselves for a great many reasons. Breaking down as many of those reasons as we can is, I believe, the best way to approach the questions I've posed in this and the previous section about why bad science is so brazenly permitted. Reductionism is a tendency to want to limit or reduce the scope of any observation into a lens of a particular worldview. For example, modern feminists will often say that a social hierarchy dominated by men, which they've dubbed the patriarchy, is the cause of all the world's issues. Political ideologues might say that all of the problems within their country are due to the party or politicians that they oppose. Religious fundamentalists often reduce every topic to something having to do with their faith, and someone who's unhappy in their marriage might reduce all of their personal problems to be the fault of their spouse. Thus, scientific reductionism is a tendency to reduce all observations and phenomena down to a scientific explanation alone. And as now comes with the territory, this is done under the assumptions of materialism. So we could retitle this slide Materialist Reductionism, if we felt so inclined. A major issue we see with the modern scientific community, and this includes both professional scientists actively working in the field, as well as the legions of ordinary folks who have decided to become unaffiliated advocates for their worldview, is a philosophical fallacy known as the appeal to authority. A fallacy is just a technical term for a logical error made while constructing arguments, of which the appeal to authority is just one. This one can be summarized as: authority figure has determined X is true, therefore it must be true. This is considered to be a fallacy because it fails to create a logical argument for something, and instead relies on blind faith in some outside source of information. It's perfectly acceptable to borrow and cite arguments from such authority figures to bolster an argument, but it is not acceptable to simply say that someone else has already proven you to be correct without representing why that's the case. Another example would be 97% of scientists polled believe in anthropogenic climate change. Therefore, there's no good reason to doubt it. This is a side effect of science being given so much weight and importance in our world nowadays. We're still living in a time where we view science as having freed our minds from the shackles of the dogmas placed on us by the Abrahamic faiths, in most cases Christianity specifically. Therefore, the people who represent science are still viewed as these enlightening hero figures. In many ways, I'm inclined to sympathize with the spirit of this view, since the scientific revolution certainly did bring with it a plethora of social benefits. The traditional religious priesthoods of history have been, and continue to be, some of the most dangerous groups of people on the planet. However, in the same way that people of antiquity might have abdicated their thinking to these authoritative vicars of God, one can't help but notice the same pattern occurring in the 21st century with the scientific community. Modern scholar Michael Tessarian once said, and I paraphrase, "The black robes of the priests have been traded for the white lab coats of the scientists." Ultimately, the game is the same. We have a class of individuals who have set themselves up as being the discoverers and holders of secret knowledge that the uninitiated are incapable of grasping. These scientific authorities are just a rebranded priest class. This serves the purpose as well of making ordinary folks feel disempowered, despite the fact that virtually anyone who can read has the capability to learn all the same information that scientists have and be able to go toe-to-toe with them on any subject they wish to study. This simple realization, though, doesn't stop the scientific community and their adherents from derisively and sarcastically asking the question, "Well, where's your degree?" anytime someone pushes back against their dogmas. Effectively, they're letting you know that if you haven't learned from their approved priests and institutions, then your knowledge, regardless of how well researched and understood it might be, is worthless. This is essentially an appeal to authority reworded. Without our stamp of approval, they say, your place is to have a seat and, like us, learn only to parrot the Holy Writ. By this logic, someone who earned a degree by simply memorizing and repeating so-called facts that were given to them in a lecture are somehow more qualified to speak on scientific topics than a person who has gone through all of the same material and then some, while also filtering that information through their critical reasoning faculties. Do we not see a problem with this? This arrangement is called credentialism and has yielded an influx of people into not only the sciences, but academia more broadly, because we've set ourselves up with the belief that such accolades are by far the best means by which a person can obtain success and happiness in their lives. This has resulted in what can easily be looked at as a debasement of higher education, since people who aren't intellectually equipped to be there flock to these universities. This is exacerbated by calls to increase the college and university enrollment numbers of certain demographics based not on intellectual potential, but on certain ethnic or sexual variables. This, in turn, leads to degree inflation, a scenario where graduating from a university carries less and less currency, followed by discontented young people who can't find work and can't financially support themselves. Couple this with the rising cost of living in many parts of the world, especially in Western country where this is so prevalent, and we've got a major sociological shitstorm in our hands. Despite this series of events and consequences being so plain to see, these very same young people tend to be the ones who dig themselves so deeply into this argument that they and others who hold the degrees have some special level of authority that is unobtainable to anyone who hasn't gone through the same institutional hoop jumping. But in reality, we now live in a world where most, if not all, of the information and knowledge from universities is freely available for anyone to learn. This is no longer a world where an accredited degree is necessary to be an expert on any given topic, much to the chagrin of these gatekeepers. I'd like to drive this point home with a few quotes from some prolific thinkers. First, from the English poet, spiritualist, and Egyptologist Gerald Massey, "They must find it difficult, those who have taken authority as truth, rather than truth as authority." From the American theoretical physicist and pioneer of quantum theory, Richard Feynman, "Science is the organized skepticism in the reliability of expert opinion." Or at least, I might add, it should be. And finally, from the French organic chemist, Pierre Beringer, "I have never confused respect for science with the taboos imposed by intellectual conformism. For me, any meticulously performed experiment is an homage to science, even if it shocks our ingrained habits." Next, I'd like to discuss another common fallacy that we see running amok in our times, and indeed throughout most of human history. And this is the appeal to majority, which states, if most people believe X, X is therefore true. This one may not be used as explicitly as the appeal to authority fallacy, but I wanted to mention it here because I think it has some explanatory power as to why the vast majority of people seem to follow mainstream science so unthinkingly. Rather than it having anything to do with an actual appreciation for science, it may simply be a herd instinct. Since these scientific authorities are held in so much esteem nowadays, it seems that it's the default position for people to put their trust in them. When everyone is doing this, it becomes a social norm. For most people, in most circumstances, breaking such social norms is an absolute no-go, even if they're hurt in some way from following them. Here's a fun example from history. This is referred to as the 1820 tomato trial, which comes from Salem, Massachusetts, United States. Somewhat close to my hometown, actually. And this is different from the town's famous witch trials, which happened at a different point in history. This story goes that, at this time and place, it was believed that tomato plants, being members of the nightshade family, bore poisonous fruits. However, one man, a retired U.S. Army colonel named Robert Gibbon Johnson, believed otherwise. He grew tomatoes in his private garden and claimed to eat them regularly. One day, he gathered a basket of freshly harvested tomato fruits and took them to the steps of the courthouse in the town square and created a spectacle when he began to eat them. Crowds flocked around him to watch this display, assuming that they were watching a prolific member of their community commit suicide for all to see. There are even reports of people in the audience fainting because of this. But as we can reasonably predict, Colonel Johnson was fine, and from that moment on, it was accepted that tomato fruits were perfectly harmless, and the American public slowly came around to eating them. Another example of the lunacy of the appeal to majority fallacy can be done through mathematics. If reality was truly democratic, then what would stop us from establishing some truly ridiculous beliefs like 3 plus 4 equals 9? Others have connected this idea to ethics and morality. For example, is it moral to seize a person's property if the majority of people in a town vote to do so? If one follows this fallacious argument to its conclusion, then we could say that something is justified simply because a majority of people believe it to be the case, even if that belief violates an individual's freedom and rights. So I'll back myself up with a few more quotes here. From rabbi, philosopher, and physician Maimonides, truth does not become more true by virtue of the fact that the entire world agrees with it, nor less so even if the whole world disagrees with it. And from the well-known American novelist Mark Twain, whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect. One is also privy to hear this phrase, scientific consensus, and this is very much what it sounds like. When any given idea or theory is favored by scientists in relevant fields, it's said that a consensus has been reached. I.e., there's such a preponderance of evidence that it's almost inconceivable that it will be overturned by counter-evidence. It's argued amongst mainstream scientists that this consensus is different from the more colloquial version of the word, as it is thought that professional scientists have a much higher standard as to what constitutes evidence, and that consensus can only be reached when these standards are shared across all members of the conversation. It's assumed then that only trained scientists have this capability, so only they can contribute to scientific consensus. And it's true that there may be positions which the vast majority of the scientific community agrees on. In theory, you could even have positions with 100% support. This isn't really an issue in and of itself, but it can become one if the scientific community uses it to gatekeep questioning and probing into a topic. I've also never heard of a discrete benchmark required for scientific consensus to be met. What percentage of scientists is required to agree on a particular point for us to be able to say that this consensus has been reached? Is it 80%, 90%, 95%? I just want a number. This is yet another phrase we saw weaponized within the recent history of the COVID hysteria. Very often it was touted that the scientific consensus was that masks and social distancing worked to stop the spread of disease, and that the so-called vaccines were safe and effective. It wasn't until after things started calming down that these PR campaigners began quietly admitting that scientists didn't actually have nearly the level of confidence that they were claiming. But at that point, the damage was already done and the cameras had turned away. So, as it turns out, you don't even need anything approaching true scientific consensus to exist for the representatives of the institutions to simply claim that it's there. Most people won't think twice and will fall under the false impression that a conclusion has been far more rigorously tested than is actually the case. So, this is a kind of weird combination of the appeals to both authority and majority mixed together. It can be summarized: if the majority of the authority group states something to be the case, there should be no further argument. Now, because we didn't have enough already, I'm going to introduce two more philosophical isms for us to add to our ever-growing pile. Another important aspect of the philosophy of science is the distinction between the positions of scientific realism and scientific anti-realism. Scientific realism is a position which states that when we make observations about the physical world, we're in fact seeing that physical world as it truly is. We're directly observing reality. For most, this is the default and common sense approach to understanding scientific discoveries, since we can assume that if we make observations, and those observations can be constructed into theories that make successful predictions, then we must have discovered some literal capital T truth about our universe. Or at least that the theory is approximately true, since even scientific realists recognize that all scientific theories require constant updates and tweaks. Scientific anti-realism, on the other hand, states that when we make observations using either our own biological faculties, eyes, ears, nose, etc., or scientific instruments such as microscopes and telescopes, we're gathering information that might usefully explain some things about reality, but that we can't know for sure that what we're seeing isn't obscured by our limited faculties and devices. This is a debate that stems from a thought that's occupied philosophers throughout the ages, which the scientific literalists are keen to ignore. How do we know that what we see is what's truly there? Or that we're seeing the entire picture? And how would we ever be able to confirm anything one way or the other with any sort of confidence? An often cited example used to describe this difference has to do with the fundamental particles that constitute matter, or physical material. At the moment, the only proof that we have that they exist is based on a combination of mathematical models and computer outputs that are attempting to make sense of something that we can't directly experience, observe, or interact with. We'll be discussing this topic more when we get into our physics module. To your average science enthusiast, statements like this might be uncomfortable to hear, but it must remain an ever-present footnote to any paradigm if we're to maintain intellectual progress. As it often is, a highly bipolar argument like this often leads to a third possibility that can be best summed up as a synthesis of the two extremes. In this particular debate, this position is called constructive empiricism. People who hold this view make the argument that, although we can't be sure that our scientific theories and models are describing the physical universe literally, they're still useful, and we should not, as some anti-realists posit, become radically skeptical of every observation that we make, or believe that scientific investigation is a complete waste of time. Now, I understand that for our purposes at the moment, this can start to seem pretty heady and technical. Unfortunately, that comes with the territory when discussing philosophy. But I'm bringing it up now not only because it's pretty central to the philosophy of science in general, but because it's a debate that's never even been brought to the attention of most students of science at the university level. Instead, students are rushed straight into memorizing and regurgitating facts, so-called, always taught to them under the default position of scientific realism. It's taken as a given that scientific investigation leads to objective truths, that we have no reason to doubt that we can trust our sensory faculties and fancy measurement devices. One excuse for this I've heard given is that because a typical 4-year science degree requires so much content to be covered, including how to use a variety of different tools and techniques necessary to know one's way around a laboratory, philosophizing about what you're learning isn't really a high priority. Scientists just don't have time for that, they say. And so the philosophy of science courses are usually relegated only to philosophy departments, if they exist at all. And in just about any modern university, they would be 100% optional for science majors anyway. The result is that we have a bunch of young students graduating with degrees in physics, chemistry, biology, etc., who are simply functional at performing tasks and memorizing trivia, but not critically analyzing anything that they learn. As an aside, for perspective, Dr. Bear Lando, an accredited scientist and doctor himself with a hefty academic and professional background in health and physiology, has stated that the acronyms BS, MS, and PhD, each standing for Bachelor of Science, Master of Science, and Doctor of Philosophy, respectively, more rightly stand for bullshit, more shit, and piled on high. And we wonder why the scientific community gets so agitated when people come along and point out the obvious weaknesses in their worldview, and how their own psychology would yield these tired insults of science denier and conspiracy theorist that get thrown around so liberally nowadays. Within the sister disciplines of psychology and neurobiology, there is a popular model referred to as the left and right brain divide, which states that the two hemispheres of the brains of animals, not only humans, are each responsible for different modes of perception. The left hemisphere is responsible for breaking reality down into smaller pieces so that the animal in question can focus on something specific that's deemed to be the most important thing at a particular moment. Think, for example, of when you feel extremely hungry. More and more, your mind begins focusing you towards the goal of eating something, all other tasks becoming less and less important as you get hungrier and hungrier. The right brain, on the other hand, concerns itself with building one single model that takes into account all of the evaluations that the mind in its entirety makes about the world. It's more concerned about holistic accuracy and ensuring that the big picture view corresponds to a consistent logic and objective observation. And so the left brain is built to construct models of the world, and may actually become frustrated when those models are challenged by outside information being imposed on it by the right brain. The thing about models, however, is that they're most often incomplete, hence the axiom given to us by statistician George Box, where he said, all models are wrong, but some are useful, as well as the quote, the map is not the territory, penned by scientist-philosopher Alfred Korzybski. An excellent read on this topic is The Master and the Emissary by psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist. His argument here is that the right brain was decreed by nature to be the master, and the left brain the emissary, or scout, which goes ahead to gather information about a particular circumstance and then report back to the right brain so that the latter can implement that information into the model of all models, as it were. There's a common claim being put forth by social commentators from various backgrounds that at our current point in history, humans are being increasingly corralled into what's called a left brain modality without our knowing it. There may be conspiratorial forces working to do this, as well as a tendency for us to do it to ourselves unconsciously in response to a seemingly hostile or stressful environment. After all, you can imagine that in times of acute stress in the life of an animal, the left brain would take over in order to focus all energy and attention towards escaping the source of stress and danger for the sake of surviving an immediate threat. One might also see how existing in the information age, where we drown daily in divisive talking points and ever-encroaching predictions of cataclysm, may be working to ensure this modality is sustained. The effects of this phenomenon can't be understated, as the left brain bias can do a lot to explain how many people fall prey to dogmatic and reductionistic worldviews. Interesting, too, that the popular understanding of the left and right brain dynamic holds that science is the dominion of the left brain, while the right brain has laid claims to the arts. This understanding, or model, of what this divide actually entails is thereby rendered inaccurate. A more learned take on the subject might be that in order to be skilled at any discipline, perhaps the sciences especially, one is required to know how to implement both hemispheres together. A fully left-brain scientist will get so caught up in their narrowly focused models that they'll be unwilling to draw connections between disciplines or change their views when new information presents itself, whereas a fully right-brain scientist would be unwilling to focus on any one particular at a time, which is essential to accomplishing anything in science. Now to begin taking on the tenets of materialism. You recall in the previous section that I briefly mentioned a philosophical position that serves as the antithesis of materialist positivism, referred to as rationalist idealism. Rationalism is the epistemology here, which states that we come to know a thing by reasoning it out, i.e., using our rational thought to deduce what is true. Idealism is the position that the fundamental reality we occupy is not that of crude matter, but mind or consciousness. Of course, this might immediately raise eyebrows for us in the 21st century, since we've been convinced that the mind or consciousness are things or processes that are produced by a material structure. Namely, in the case of humans and other similar animals, a brain and nervous system. The idealist tradition, however, which includes such illustrious names as Plato, Aristotle, Immanuel Kant, Georg Hegel, Friedrich Schelling, and a host of others, asserts that mind is a sort of substrata which gives rise to physical matter. Although coming up with a simple statement that can both summarize idealism at its core and capture the myriad differences between its intellectual champions is near impossible. Idealism is present in virtually every religious creation myth the world over, including the Book of Genesis, where God speaks to manifest the creation, or the Hindu belief that our reality is a dream of Vishnu. We can even see it in literature, such as Tolkien's Silmarillion, where Eru Iluvatar and his Ainur sing the universe into existence. Indeed, even members of the German idealist school, notably Hegel, who I mentioned a moment ago, indicated that God could be thought of synonymously with mind and consciousness, rather than as the anthropomorphic father figure that we, namely those of us in the Western world, have been conditioned with over the past millennia. Some might be familiar with the old Carl Sagan quote, "We are a way for the universe to know itself." And this is an apt description, but might be slightly altered here to "we are a way for mind to know itself." I'll have to leave it there for now, but for a fantastic introduction and overview of this topic, I'll point you all to Michael Tessarian's presentation on unslaved.com, which is well worth the subscription to gain access to, I can assure you. Link is in the description. So to clarify and simplify, materialism asserts that matter gives rise to mind, and idealism says that it's the other way around. The salient culture of mainstream science is couched almost entirely within materialism, opting to withhold consideration of anything idealistic for fear of coming off as some sort of mystic or New Age crank. However, as we'll start to see shortly, there are some well-warranted cracks beginning to show here. But we also need not fall victim to a false dichotomy. It could be that neither of these two paradigms are correct. Maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle, and mind and matter are actually one and the same thing looked at from different angles, like electricity and magnetism, or a back and a front. This as well might satisfy Hegel, who had much to say on the evolution of consciousness being founded on the process of theses and antitheses coming together to create syntheses, but we need not delve into that now. Or it might even be that the truth is some other explanation way out in left field somewhere. We're not really in any position to know for sure. That's what makes this conversation so interesting. Combining everything we've been speaking about here so far and in the previous two sections, apathy towards potentially fraudulent publication, as we discussed in Section 3, an acceptance of the materialist positivist paradigm, as defined in Section 4, a proclivity for scientific reductionism, justification of beliefs via appeals to authority and consensus, a dogmatic assumption of scientific realism, and a left-brain modality, we have now given birth to Scientism, the new secular religion of our modern age. But this consideration of the primacy of consciousness isn't some new fad within the sciences, but rather one that's been declared by various geniuses within its halls for centuries. Here are just a few quotes to whet our appetites. From the German theoretical physicist Max Planck, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existence, postulates consciousness." From the English physicist, mathematician, and astronomer Sir James Jeans, "The stream of human knowledge is impartially heading towards a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. Mind no longer appears as an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We're beginning to suspect that we ought rather to hail it as the creator and governor of this realm." And where would we be without the great Nikola Tesla, who said, "The day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in one decade than in all the previous centuries of its existence." The field of biology seems to be stubbornly married to Newtonian physics, this study of mass, inertia, velocity, etc. on everyday objects. This way of looking at the world is highly deterministic via mathematics. And so when applied to human beings, it's assumed that free will is at best an illusion, and that all behavior can be reduced to an, albeit complex, set of calculations whose variables are garnered from the amalgam of biochemistry that takes place within our organism. Every aspect of our behavior can therefore be predicted. While this field of physics has obvious applications, it has in many ways been superseded by quantum physics, which carried with it enormous implications regarding the role that consciousness and perception seem to have in constructing the physical reality that we inhabit and are made from. In his 2005 book, The Biology of Belief, developmental biologist Dr. Bruce Lipton expounds the idea that the physical body is not beholden to the molecular mechanics of DNA and other cellular components, as materialism teaches. Instead, such things are downstream of environmental conditions, which include, most importantly, our thoughts and mindsets. Of course, this has earned him the collective ire of the old guard at large, who hand-wave him as a crank and quack, effectively blacklisting him from any consideration by the institutionalized minds. See his Wikipedia page for evidence of this, where the actual content of his theories are absent, replaced instead by remarks that he hasn't published in any reputable journals, and commits the most brazen crime of being anti-vaccine. However, a growing number of scientists seem to be coming around to this paradigm in different ways, and are starting to gain some real attention. Other well-known and equally hinterlanded names including Dr. Robert Lanza with his theory of biocentrism and Dr. Rupert Sheldrake with his theory of morphogenetic fields. All three of these men will receive attention at a more appropriate point in a later module of Lifeology, so let's move on for now. Now, I'm going to take a break from talking and play a clip from the first episode of Season 2 of Through the Wormhole, a series of the 2010s which tackled a number of interesting scientific questions, hosted by none other than Morgan Freeman. Let's have a watch.
Dr. Stuart Hameroff is the Director of Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona, Tucson. He's also a practicing anesthesiologist.
Okay, everything is going to go real smooth. You just pick out a nice dream, and you'll wake up feeling really, really nice. Under anesthesia, patients don't dream, even though I said pick out a nice dream, we always say that, but there's no awareness, there's no passage of time. Patients wake up, they don't know if they've been asleep 5 minutes or 5 hours. Anesthesia takes away consciousness. The brain under anesthesia is quite active, and the difference is still somewhat mysterious.
Years watching over patients in the operating room made Hameroff obsessed with understanding the link between brain activity and consciousness. Then, 15 years ago, he met the great British physicist Sir Roger Penrose. Together, they developed a radical new theory for how the brain works. A theory that has grown into nothing less than a scientific argument for an eternal soul. At its root are tiny structures inside our brain cells called microtubules.
If you look inside a cell, you find structural components that are somewhat like the bones within our bodies. The microtubules develop literally a forest inside each cell, which determines the architecture and the structure of the cell. And we think microtubules are perfectly designed to be the cell's onboard computer and process information at the molecular level.
Hameroff and Penrose argue that microtubules allow neurons and the brain as a whole to function as a quantum computer, performing operations in a fundamentally different way from normal computers.
So here we have a brain with two hemispheres. Most views of the brain are of a collection of individual neurons. When one neuron fires, it sends a signal to the next neuron at a synapse. That in turn causes that neuron to fire, and that neuron causes another neuron to fire, much like dominoes. So for example, if a neuron fires here, it's going to trigger its neighbors to fire, sending signals through and around the brain. That's the classical view of how the brain works.
In a conventional computer, signals move around from place to place along traceable paths. But the microscopic components of a quantum computer are connected via a mysterious process called entanglement.
Some of us think that quantum processes play an important role in consciousness in the brain. So, for example, if there's neuronal activity here, it may be coupled through quantum non-locality to processes over here. These neurons are connected even though they're spatially separated, so that activity here instantaneously affects activity over here.
Hameroff and Penrose argued that a change in the microtubules in one brain cell can affect microtubules in another. But that's not all. Quantum theory claims that every single point in space, even empty space, can contain information.
At the very fine structure of the universe, there is information, quantum information, not unlike these dominoes, so that we can have information up or down, here and here, but they're connected, so that something that happens here influences something here.
This means the information in the microtubules can connect and become entangled with the universe outside the brain.
So just like these two neurons may be entangled, it's possible that the information of consciousness of the whole brain is entangled and can exist in the universe at large.
According to Hameroff, our souls are built from something much more fundamental than neurons. They are constructed from the very fabric of the universe.
Inevitably here, we were going to come to one of the most important experiments in the history of scientific investigation, the double-slit experiment. This is an experiment that's been repeated and tweaked many times since it was first done in 1801 by British polymath Thomas Young, who was among many natural philosophers interested in the nature of light. What he discovered has had a profound implication on our modern view of physics, and is still to this day being analyzed and worked out. But what exactly is it? To understand it, let's paint ourselves a picture. To begin, let's envision a serene lake on a windless day. No waves or ripples, just a mirror-smooth surface. Now, extend two walls towards each other crossing the center of the pond, leaving a small gap of about a meter between them before they meet, like so. Next, we'll take an aerial view directly above the wall. If we send a wave at the wall, we would likely expect to see the wave bounce backwards in the opposite direction once it makes contact with it. However, the segment of the wave that coincides with the gap between the walls will be allowed to continue to the other side of the lake. But what will this wave look like? Will we see a small rectangular segment simply race towards the opposite bank? Actually, no. What's observed, and this has been confirmed time and time again, is that the wave that continues through the gap looks like this, a sort of semicircle that grows larger as it continues to move forward. Send a series of waves at the wall, and this pattern that you see here will start to emerge. Now, let's alter the wall in the lake by introducing a second gap, like so. We return to our aerial view and send another series of wave fronts. We'll see the same pattern as before start to occur, except obviously now we're going to have these two overlapping wave patterns moving across the surface of the lake. In order to analyze what's going on here, and more importantly to see why it's relevant to light, and even more importantly why it's relevant to our discussion about materialism, idealism, and the fundamental structure of the universe, we'll have to go over some basic terminology about waves. First, this straight blue line here is called a line of zero disturbance. This is a representation of the medium through which our wave is moving when that medium is undisturbed, or in other words, when it's not waving. In our case then, this is going to represent the water of the lake. This, for lack of a better term, wavy line then obviously represents, what else, a wave. At this point, the line of zero disturbance is only there as a mathematical tool to provide reference for how much the medium, the water, is disturbed. When the wave goes up above the zero disturbance line, we call that segment a crest, and where it goes below the line, it's a trough. Finally, there's a measurement we can take called the amplitude, which is expressed in length, so think meters, centimeters, etc., from the zero disturbance line to the topmost point of a crest or the bottommost point of a trough. Of course, there are plenty more concepts and measurements associated with waves that one can learn about, such as wavelength and frequency, but those will be saved for the Lifeology physics module. If you're interested, you'll have to sign up for the full course, or go and research them on your own somewhere else. Recall that when we put two gaps in our wall, we had wave patterns that quickly began to intersect with each other. In the study of wave mechanics, when waves cross over each other like that, it's referred to as interference, and interference can take one of two forms. The first form can be illustrated by sending two waves at each other like so. When we have the crests aligned with crests and the troughs aligned with troughs, like so, the amplitudes will combine and we'll see a much larger wave appear for as long as the wavefronts are moving through each other's space. But in instances where the crests and troughs oppose each other, we get something called destructive interference. Here, the amplitudes of intersecting waves are still added together, the exact same principle as before, but because those amplitudes are in opposite directions of each other, they'll pull each other towards the zero displacement line. If the opposing amplitudes have the exact same magnitude, then we can observe a momentary collapse of the waveform as the interference is taking place. Here's a short clip from YouTube physics educator Veritasium, where I believe he does a fantastic job illustrating everything I've been trying to explain in the past couple of slides.
When I create ripples with a single source, they travel out with circular wavefronts. Nothing particularly surprising there. But if I add a second source of ripples, then we start getting an interesting pattern. This pattern is created by the ripples from the two sources interacting with each other. Where they meet up peaks with peaks and troughs with troughs, the amplitude of the wave is increased. That's what we call constructive interference. But if the peak from one wave meets up with the trough from the other, then we get destructive interference and there's basically no wave there.
So we ask again, what does all this have to do with light? Well, in Thomas Young's day, just like today, scientists could spend all day watching how water behaves. But light was far more mysterious and much more difficult to observe. One of the great armchair debates at the time was whether the phenomenon of light could be better described as a wave or a particle. A particle we can think of as a very small solid object, and so it was theorized by some that light was the amalgamation of tiny light balls zooming around. Young became the first person we know of to take the pontificating out of the cafes and salons and put it to the actual test. This test is what would come to be known as the double slit experiment, and its genius was in its simplicity. Because the wave pattern dynamics we've been describing were widely known at the time, he figured he could exploit them to finally get a glimpse of what light is actually doing as it goes about doing its illumination business. His idea was simple. Take a light source and shine it at an optical screen, similar to the material that old photographs used to be printed on, where light would burn an image onto it. However, between the screen and the light source, Young placed a barrier with two slits in it, in just the same fashion as our double-gapped wall across the lake. His presumption was that if light was a wave, then after he shined it at the optical screen, the output would represent a pattern that reflected an interference pattern as depicted in the previous slides and video clip. And indeed, this is exactly what Young saw when he looked at the screen after running the experiment. Voila then, light was determined to be a wave. However, later physics experimentation determined that light could be divided into quantum units called photons, which can be thought of as discrete packets of light. So scientists of subsequent generations reran Young's double slit experiment using a device that could emit light one photon at a time. They predicted that if they did this, they would get a pattern on the optical screen that looks something like this, with two distinct bands of light made up of little tiny dots. But they were shocked to find that even when they did this, they got the same kind of wave interference pattern that Young had observed. Not to be deterred, the experiment was run again, but this time, thanks again to further advances in technology, the researchers used a photon detector to determine where each photon of light was at any given time, because they wanted to be able to trace its path and see how exactly they were all working together to produce an interference pattern. However, when they ran the experiment this way, the resulting optical screen no longer showed the wave interference pattern, and instead showed an outcome with these two distinct bands, on par with the original prediction of using a single photon light source. So what do we draw from this? Well, the simplest and most poignant interpretation is that reality, on some fundamental level, appears to change its behavior based on whether or not we're paying too close attention to it. This is remarkably profound, and yet the implications still haven't been fully acknowledged by the scientific community collectively. It indicates that consciousness is a key factor in deciding what is real and what is not. This is anathema to the materialist ontological view, but fits quite readily into that of idealism, since it would seem here that the physical world is subject to consciousness. No matter which way we turn this, we're forced to admit that something incredibly strange is happening here. It could be that our human senses and/or our technology is unable to render reality correctly, which undermines empiricism and positivism. Additionally, we might conclude that the substrata of the material universe is conscious and appears to make decisions about how it manifests based on how aware we are of it, which undermines materialism. Some have taken this finding and used it to posit ideas such as the many worlds or multiverse hypothesis, which we spoke of at the very beginning of this module. But for reasons we don't have time to get into now, this proposal is tenuous and relies far too heavily on mathematical abstraction and weak assumptions to gain any real momentum scientifically. Beyond even this weirdness with the double slit experiment, there are other opinions within the field of physics that the photons we spoke of aren't even real in the way that we think of things as being real. Instead, they say that what we call photons are simply measurements of excitations in a quantum field. We'll have to unpack that one in a later lesson. Still, other physicists think photons are a purely mathematical concept that we can't really prove to exist in any final way. They're just models used to describe the properties of light in the same way that certain math equations are used to describe the properties of shapes and objects. Taking it yet another step further, there's the example of Walter Russell, an American artist and philosopher who came up with an idea for how light, magnetism, electricity, and pretty much everything else in the universe worked that was radically different from what the mainstream scientists believed or believe still. Full disclosure, I'm currently still learning even the basics of what Russell was talking about, but it seems to be largely based on his cubic wave field model, where it suggested that these cube structures that contain spherical waveforms make up all bodies and objects. He believed that the universe did not have a beginning, that it's been around forever, and so therefore time doesn't apply in the way that it normally does for us. The Big Bang Theory, he said, violated the basic laws of nature, and all matter is the result of compression and expansion forces on objects. He also came up with his own version of the periodic table, which he felt better represented the true nature of the physical elements. It was in a circle shape and represented far more properties than the typical Mendelevian version that we see 99.9% of the time. Through his study and insights into the nature of matter, he also predicted the discovery of the radioactive atoms deuterium, tritium, neptunium, and plutonium before they were known to mainstream science. He also warned that their misuse would lead to humanity's destruction. In other words, he knew of their destructive potential if applied to things like atomic bombs. If you were to go and read his scientific works, they don't at all read like a textbook, but instead almost like poetry or a religious sermon. He believed that modern science didn't work in large part because it didn't acknowledge God. However, his ideas about the nature and identity of God were far different than those held by modern religious adherents, the Christians, Jews, Muslims, etc. Like the idealists previously discussed, to Russell, God was not an external anthropomorphic father figure in the sky who crafted the universe like a child in a sandbox, and now sits in judgment of humanity's trespasses against him and his laws. Russell instead defined God as the invisible, motionless, sexless, undivided, and unconditioned white magnetic light of mind. So now you can spend a lifetime trying to ponder out that one. Ultimately, Russell believed that understanding science, understanding oneself, and understanding God were all one and the same thing. You won't be able to find the ultimate answers through only examining the world around you, but by examining your mind first and foremost. What's interesting is that throughout history, almost every mystical and esoteric school worth their salt have taught this same exact lesson. It's only been relatively recently that humans have decided to forego this advice in favor of running around with magnifying glasses in order to categorize the external world, believing that this provides them with enlightenment. The result, however, seems to be worse physical and mental health, more destructive warfare, and an overall loss of happiness across the world. It might be easy for many to dismiss Russell as just another of history's eccentrics. But even to this day, a growing number of scientists are starting to look back at his work with some level of consideration. Also, Nikola Tesla himself had a close friendship with Russell. Russell was a bit younger and was deeply influenced by many of Tesla's ideas. Upon learning about Russell's theories for how the universe works, Tesla famously told him that he must, quote, lock his ideas away for 1,000 years, because humanity is not mature enough to handle them yet. And while I don't want this to come across as an appeal to authority, it's still quite interesting to note that such a prolific thinker held Russell in so high esteem. Aside from his scientific contributions, Russell was also an accomplished painter, sculptor, architect, and fiction writer. I'd say that's all quite the resume for a guy who dropped out of school at the age of 9 to take his education into his own hands. But I'd like to hone in a bit more on Russell's cubic wave field model of the atom. Here on the left is a typical model of an atom as presented in most physics and chemistry textbooks the world over. This image has become almost synonymous with science as a whole, I dare say. On the right side of the screen are some depictions of the cubic wave field model. And this is Erwin Wilhelm Müller, a German microscopist credited with inventing the field emission electron microscope and the first person to ever see and photograph an atom. His micrographs, which he published in a series of books, looked much more like this. What you're seeing, according to Müller, is an image of a tungsten atom, or in the very least the energy fields associated with it, with the black supposedly representing empty space. Contrary to the common model of the atom which mainstream science textbooks show us, with its more or less fixed solid nucleus of protons and neutrons, this image seems to indicate that the nuclei of atoms are hollow, as if they're not there. Could it be that our ideas about how atoms work are entirely misguided? An interesting question to ponder. To conclude this bit on Russell, I'll leave you guys with a quote from the man himself. When our knowing exceeds our sensing, we will no longer be deceived by the illusions of our senses. Yet another interesting take on this topic is discussed in a rather peculiar series of books called The Ringing Cedars of Russia, written by Vladimir Megre, a Russian entrepreneur turned reporter of a chance meeting with a young woman living as a recluse in the Siberian taiga named Anastasia. Through a series of events outlined in his 10 books, Anastasia ends up sharing with Megre, and by extension his readers, a multitude of ideas about humanity's origins and potential, as well as some insightful explanations about how our world has found itself in its current dysfunctional state. Anastasia proclaims that the entirety of the universe is akin to a great thought of the Creator God. We, as his children, are given the charge of ordering and beautifying the planet in a process of what she refers to as co-creation. And because we're emanations of this Creator, we have the innate capacity to mold the earth into whatever our thoughts see fit to have it become. If we're aligned with the natural systems already put in place and recognize ourselves as the miracles that we are, then through co-creation we can achieve paradise on earth and perhaps beyond. She then argues that what holds us back from this achievement is our dogmas, our inflexible paradigms, be they religious or secular. These atrophy the mind, collectivize us, stir us to anger against those who disagree, and keep us locked into discord with one another and with nature. Many of the claims made by Vladimir and Anastasia throughout the books admittedly require a leap of faith to take on board, at least in regards to whether or not everything spoken about literally happened. One has to read it for themselves and be the judge of that. But from my own experience after having gone through them, I can say that at least the ideas certainly resonated, and have a certain simple logic to them that was difficult to dismiss. So check them out if you feel so inclined. My hope here in showcasing these ideas about idealism, the biology of belief, the double slit experiment, Russellian cubic wave fields, and Anastasia's co-creation is to provide a context for open-minded learners to begin considering the complexity and wonder of our existence. It's long overdue that a study of science divorces itself from the default framing of positivist materialism, freeing itself to explore just how integral we and all other entities that inhabit our world are to the entire process of existence. No longer do we need to view ourselves and one another as separate objects, alienated from each other and at the mercy of blind forces of nature, placed here accidentally and against our will. But, as we'll see in an upcoming section, there are many out there who seem to prefer this latter paradigm. The reasons why this is will be explored when we get there. And so that's it for now. I'll see you all in the next one.